It's great to see everybody. For those of you watching online, we're glad that you're watching. Just a quick announcement. As many of you know, this has been not the easiest year, I guess is a good way to say that, but there have been a lot of good things that have happened. And one of the good things that has happened is so many people who call FCC home have continued to give and continue to be generous, which has enabled us to continue to invest in the future and also try to do some things to impact our community. You should have received a letter this past week. If you didn't, hopefully it's in the mail and you'll get it early this next week that explains how our Christmas offering this year is going to work. Every year, that's a big part of our Christmas celebration. And rather than giving all of your money to Amazon this year, we want to let you have an opportunity to invest in some things that are close to God's heart. So you can read about it in the letter. The breakdown this year will be 50% of whatever's collected will go towards the promise, which we think is an investment in our future. 25% will go to Clinton Looney, who is one of our mission partners in Mexico, who has been down there just for decades doing some incredible work. And then 25% will go to what we're calling community-based missions. There's a lot of things happening in our community right now, and we want to be able to seize those opportunities as they come. So we're going to save 25% of that to do that. So a lot of different ways to give this year, whether you're at home or here or whatever. All of that will be explained in the letter. If you didn't get the letter, let David or I know, or we'll be glad to try to explain it, or you can certainly call the office. All right, if you have your Bible, I want you to turn to John chapter 1. John chapter 1. So last Tuesday night, I did something that I find myself doing rather often, and that's I had to stop at Walmart on the way home. And so I went in, and it took me probably 10 minutes to find the things I need to pick up. But then if you've been to Walmart lately, you know this time of year, it's really busy. I mean, there's people everywhere. And when I got up to the front to check out, every checkout lane was backed up just horribly. So I stood in line, and if you've been doing that, especially during this period, it's really awkward because you're trying not to, crowd the person in front of you, and you're scared like if you get within 10 feet of them, the alarm's going to go off, and the security's going to come out. So I'm standing there waiting. You're trying to talk to people through a mask, and it's really a weird deal. But I was standing there talking to somebody and doing the best I could not to touch anybody, and for some reason there was this lull in the noise level in the store. And all of a sudden, I heard the voice of Bing Crosby singing Silver Bells over the PA system. You've probably had that. I don't know if it's the Walmart radio network or what, but all of a sudden you hear city sidewalks, busy sidewalks, and you know the whole deal. Then it goes on, talks about these silver bells that are ringing on every corner. Now, that's one of my favorite Christmas songs. A lot of people don't know this. It's actually a reference to the Salvation Army. That's what the bells are. Talking about if you've been to the city, you see the Salvation Army people on each corner. So I was listening to that just for the faintest moment that I could hear it, and it got stuck in my head. I don't know how it is for you, but when I get a song stuck in my head, I have a hard time getting it out. So a few hours later, I'm sitting at home, and I find myself singing those words to myself. Now, nobody else can hear me, but I'm just sort of quietly under my breath. And if you're familiar with the song, it describes Christmas in an urban environment, which is different than what most of us have experienced, but I think it's a neat song. But as I was singing through it, I had this realization of something I don't think I'd ever realized before. In fact, I pulled out my phone and I Googled the lyrics just to make sure I was right. And sure enough, I was. Now, if you're familiar with the song, it's got all this imagery, right? Busy sidewalks and children laughing and bells ringing and lights blinking and shoppers rushing. And you get to the last little bit there, and there's even an appearance by Santa. But as you go through the song, there's one thing that's missing. There's not one reference to Christmas in the entire song. There's not one actual reference, not even a veiled reference to the actual birth of Jesus. Now, a lot of things that describe what goes on this time of year, but there's nothing in the song at all that even hints at what Christmas is really about. Now, I don't know how that strikes you, but I thought it was ironic that one of the most popular Christmas songs in history has nothing to do with Christmas. So I started thinking about some other songs that are popular. I started looking at some lyrics, and songs like White Christmas, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, Winter Wonderland, Santa Claus is Coming to Town, Rocking Around the Christmas Tree, the classic grandma got run over by a reindeer. It's the most wonderful time of year. You go through, and all of those songs are catchy, and we hear them this time of year, and none of them have anything at all to do with Christmas. Not even a hint of what Christmas is about. Some of the most popular Christmas songs in history with nothing to do with Christmas. Then not long ago, I read this quote by Tim Keller. I want you to listen to how he describes how this happened. He writes, "Christmas is the only Christian holy day that is also a major secular holiday, arguably our culture's biggest. The result is two different celebrations, each observed by millions of people at the very same time. This brings discomfort on both sides. Many Christians can't help but notice that more and more of the public festivities surrounding Christmas studiously avoid any reference to its Christian origins. The holiday is promoted as a time for family, for giving, and for peace in the world. As one popular columnist put it, Christmas is a wonderful secular holiday. On the other hand, non-religious people can't help but find the older meaning of Christmas keeps intruding uninvited through the music of traditional Christmas carols." Now, you and I find ourselves living at a time in which there are two distinct yet simultaneous celebrations that both go by the name Christmas. One is defined by family gatherings, decorations, gift exchanges, Hallmark movies, maybe ugly Christmas sweaters. The other is by definition a celebration of the light coming into a dark world. Now, if you have your Bible open to John chapter 1, we're going to look at this morning is a passage of Scripture that on first reading seems to leave out the Christmas story. Just like the songs. We read through this, you'll quickly notice there's no mention of a manger, there are no angels, there's no wise men, there's no stable, none of that shows up. And in fact, it's a much different feel than what the other gospel writers present. And the reason it's so different is because when John sat down to write the gospel that bears his name, his purpose was different. Now, you open up the New Testament, the first four books are what we call the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And together, they all tell the story of Jesus' birth and Jesus' life from four different perspectives. But what's important to remember is that John, the one we're going to look at today, was written 40 or 50 years after the first three Gospels were written. And by the time John sits down to write his version of the story, he's literally spent decades reflecting back on what he'd experienced. That's why he doesn't just tell us what happened. He goes deeper than that, and he tries to explain why it happened and what it all means. But the thing to keep in mind is that for nearly 5 decades, John, who by the time he wrote this was a pretty old man, had been telling these stories. He'd been thinking about these stories from every conceivable angle. And something else that makes this interesting is, the best we can tell, by the time he finally got around to writing these things down, the Apostle John was the last man standing. He was the last of the 12 apostles that had been with Jesus that was still alive. His voice was the last voice of those who had walked with Jesus. One more thing that makes this interesting. If you fast forward to the crucifixion, there's this scene where Jesus is hanging on the cross, and he looks down into this crowd of people that have assembled around him, and he sees his mother, Mary. And standing next to her is John, the guy who wrote this. There's this powerful moment where Jesus looks at Mary. He's concerned about his mother. He's concerned about what's going to happen in the future. So he says to her, "Hey, I want you to go and live with John. You accept John as if he's your son." And then he looks at John, his closest friend. He says, "I want you to take care of my mother. You accept her as if she were your mother." And historians tell us that's what happened. Mary goes and she lives with John. And we don't know how long she lived, but the one thing we do know is, what is every mother's favorite topic of conversation? Her children. So if there was anybody on planet Earth that knew the story of Jesus' birth, it would have been John. I mean, he'd probably heard that story more times than any of us could count. And yet, when he sits down to write his version of the Christmas story, he skips over all that. He doesn't go back to the night that Jesus was born in the manger. Instead, he goes back much further than that. He goes back all the way to the beginning. John chapter 1, verse 1. Listen to this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Now, throughout the Bible, there are certain passages that are more important than others, at least in terms of your understanding what Scripture teaches. And this is one of them. You could spend the next 2 months sort of working through this passage because there's a lot here. But for our purposes this morning, I want you to focus on verse 5. Look at it again. He says, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Your translation might say, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not understood it. Sometimes it gets translated as overcome. Sometimes it gets translated as understood. It's the same Greek word. It just gets translated into English in 2 different ways. And the question is, what does it mean? Well, in Greek, it's a very, very forceful word that gets used in 2 different ways. Sometimes it's used to describe a physical battle between 2 powerful enemies. So it might be 2 armies colliding on a battlefield, might be 2 strong people getting into it, and the literal meaning is to hold down. So if you find yourself in a fight and the other person is holding you down, that's a pretty good indication that you lost the fight, or at least you're losing the fight. The other way it gets used is in terms of understood. It means to intellectually master something. So if you ever heard somebody referred to as a master in their field, that means they have some power over what they've learned. Popular way of saying that they have power over what they've studied. So with that in mind, I want you to listen to this again the way John says this. He says, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. The darkness has not held it down or has not understood it. The darkness has not mastered the light. And one of the things that John is clear about is that we live in a dark world. We live in a world that sometimes feels really dark. You may have seen this past week, Google released the top searches from 2020. Whatever you type in the search engine, they keep track of that, and they released their top sort of things. And some of them, kind of expected. For example, this year was how to use Zoom, how to cut your hair at home, where to find toilet paper, PlayStation 5, election results, and he had this list of athletes and actors and politicians and all that. But there were some other things on the list that paint a picture of a world that sometimes feels really dark. The Kobe Bryant crash, coronavirus symptoms, unemployment, stock market crash, stimulus checks, the Australian fires, Iran, North Korea. I was reading through all this list, and I wondered how many of those did I type in at different moments. I wonder how many of those you typed in. But one thing that's important to understand as you read this is that the Apostle John, he understood what it was like better than any of us. He understood what it was like to live in a dark world. As I mentioned, by the time he wrote this, all of the other disciples are dead. Most of them have been martyred in incredibly painful ways at the hands of the Roman Emperor Nero. At the same time, John, who's now old, has lived his entire life with a target on his back because of his prominence in the church. In fact, he'll end his life as a prisoner, exiled to the island of Patmos, far away from the people he loves. There's also some indication that he lived long enough to see the city that he loved, Jerusalem, and the temple where he had spent so much of his time completely destroyed at the hands of the Roman Empire. So make sure you understand that John was a guy who understood what it means to be surrounded by darkness. He understood what it was like to feel like the world was crumbling down on top of you. And yet, despite all of the darkness that had impacted his life, John had learned something that made a huge difference. It's the key truth from this passage that we want to focus on this morning. According to John, the light will ultimately triumph over the darkness. Doesn't always feel like that, and sometimes the evidence doesn't seem to point to that conclusion, but the truth is that the light will ultimately triumph over the darkness. And John wants us to know that in spite of all the darkness, in spite of the pain, in spite of all the loss, in spite of all the persecution, in spite of all the never-ending challenges, the darkness will never overpower the light. The darkness will never master the light. The light will ultimately triumph over the darkness. You might think about it like this. You ever been in a cave, or maybe a room in your basement where there are no windows? It can be so dark. In some of those places, you can wave your hand in front of your face and you can't see it. But what happens if you light a candle or you turn on the flashlight on your cell phone? What happens? Does the darkness extinguish the light? No, the light lights up the darkness. Doesn't matter how thick the darkness is. You turn on just the faintest light and the darkness begins to dissipate. And what John is saying here is that even though the darkness feels pretty thick, the light will ultimately overwhelm the darkness. Now, as you go through this passage, there's a lot of things you could talk about. But for our purposes this morning, there are three phrases that John uses, I just want to point out to you, that help explain why we can have confidence that the light will eventually triumph over the darkness. Here's the first phrase. It's at the end of verse 1. When John says the Word is God. I want you to check this out again. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning, and through Him all things were made. Without Him nothing was made that has been made. So the Greek word that gets translated as word is the word logos. It's kind of this philosophical term. Socrates and Plato used it. A lot of the philosophers used it. But what John does here is he borrows from the world of philosophy, and rather than talking about this abstract principle that they talk about that's hard to nail down, he applies that same thing to a person. And he tells us two very specific things about this person. First, he says that this person, this word is eternal. He has no beginning, and he'll have no end because he exists outside of time. So John says, in the beginning was the Word. That means that before anything else was created, the Word, or this person that John keeps referring to as the Word, already existed. Therefore, he was never created because he already exists. Now, the reason that's important is because in John's day, and even in our day, there are certain religious groups, and you've probably had some interactions with them over the last few months, that make the claim that Jesus is not really God. He's only the first created being, and that somewhere along the way, God the Father decided to create God the Son and bring him into existence. That's what the Jehovah's Witnesses believe. That's also what the Latter-day Saints believe. They believe that God the Father created God the Son. But when you look at what John wrote, he makes it clear that the Word, or the Son, has always existed. The second thing that John tells us is that the Word is the creator of all things. He says that through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that has been made. Flip over to Colossians 1. The Apostle Paul picks up the same theme. He says it like this: for in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. Now here's why that's important. You come to this time of year, and if there's one word that you should be able to use to describe what you're experiencing this time of year, it should be the word celebration. You get to December, it's a month of celebration. Christmas parties, family gatherings, you get to eat all the food, you have the gift exchanges. Then when that's over, you start making plans for New Year's, and it should be a month of celebration. It's supposed to be a time of joy and laughter and fun. But it's not always like that, is it? And for a lot of people, you get to this time of year, and rather than being a time of celebration, it's a time of frustration. And to be honest, it may be more frustrating this year than it's ever been before. Why is it so frustrating? It's frustrating because at some level there's something that we wish was different that we can't change. We're frustrated because we feel powerless. I love the way Andy Stanley put this. He said, for a lot of people, the Christmas season is a yearly reminder that there are problems we can't solve, people we can't control, and expectations that we can't meet. Some of you are going through that right now. You're trying to plan your family gatherings, and it's getting complicated. This person refuses to be in the same room with this person. This person says they're not coming because they're mad about something that happened this year. Or maybe you're thinking about the places that you're going to go, and you know it's not going to be that enjoyable because the people there are going to spend the whole time, tearing you down, and there's nothing you can do about it, and you're frustrated. Every one of us has something, some situation, some person in our life that we wish we could change, that we're completely powerless to change. And for people like us, the only possible way that we can experience real and lasting change is by having a relationship with somebody who's all-powerful, somebody who's always existed, and somebody who created all things. We might feel powerless, but if you believe what John said, then the person he's talking about is all-powerful. Now, that leads to the second thing, and it's the phrase, the Word became flesh. Check out verse 9. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. Verse 14, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, verse 14 is one you should underline, maybe circle that in your Bible. It's one of those verses in the New Testament that it's the verse that theologians point to describe what they call the incarnation. It's this idea that the pre-existent Word, or this Word that was God, left behind the glories of heaven, and he came to earth in the form of a helpless, needy, snotty-nosed baby boy. That's why John says, hey, we have seen his glory. Over in 1 John, the first of three letters that bears John's name, he said it this way. He said, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our own eyes, which we have looked at and our hands have touched. This we proclaim concerning the word of life. So John said, hey, this is not something we heard about. This is not something somebody told us about. This is not something we came up with. This was someone that we saw with our own eyes and touched with our own hands. For John, this was not something he heard about. This was someone that he knew personally. Now I have a picture that I want to show you. Most of you know I've got three knucklehead sons at home. And the oldest one there is Cannon. He's 5 years old. And the two younger ones are Andrew and Jack. They'll be 10 months old on Christmas Eve. And the little guys there are just now getting to the point where they can hold their own bottle. You know what I mean? So if I give them the bottle, they can kind of hold it. But up until this point, for the last 10 months, almost 10 months, we've had to do literally everything for them. So time to take a bath, we have to wash them. Time to change the clothes, we have to change them. Time to feed them, we have to feed them. When there's a dirty diaper, Jamie has to change them. And I mean, you know how it goes. There's just whatever they need, we have to do it. They're completely helpless. They can't do it for themselves. So you realize all that. And just like you were with your kids, you have to do it for them. And then you read the Christmas story, you read the Christmas narrative, and the question that keeps coming up is why? I mean, why would God the Son, why would the second person of the Trinity stoop down to our level and come to the earth in the form of a helpless baby? And the answer is, he does that so that he can better relate to us. He became one of us so that he could connect with us. Hebrews 4, the writer says it like this, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way just as we are, and yet he did not sin. Now if that's true, and over again New Testament writers say that it is. That means that not only is he all-powerful, it means he also understands exactly what you're going through, because he went through it too. He knows what it's like when you're more frustrated than you are interested in celebrating. He knows what it's like when your family gets on your nerves. He knows what it's like when a friend stabs you in the back. He knows what it's like when your finances are tight and you don't know where your next meal is going to come from. He knows what it's like to be poor. He knows what it's like to be lied about and misrepresented and misunderstood. He knows what it's like to have to say goodbye to somebody you love. He knows what it's like to live with physical pain. He knows what it's like to live with emotional scars. And the reason he understands all that is because he became one of us so that he could connect with us. Now, the last phrase I want you to pay attention to is this one. The Word has made the Father known. Listen to verse 15. John testified concerning, talking about John the Baptist, he cried out saying, "This is the one I spoke about when I said, 'He who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me.' Out of his fullness, we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known." Now, throughout history, there's been one question that has haunted the human race, and even today people ask this same question, and you'll encounter different versions of it, but it goes something like this: assuming that there is a God that exists, then what is he like? Now, a lot of people throughout history ask that question. There's been a lot of different competing answers to that question. For a lot of people, they're convinced that if God exists at all, then at best he's sort of a detached ruler, worse, maybe he's an incompetent dictator. And they look around at all the evil in the world and they ask the question, then why doesn't God do something about all this? And then when he doesn't do something, or at least doesn't do what they think he should do, then they conclude that he's incapable of fixing our problems. In that sense, he's incompetent, or he just doesn't care. And he looks around and he sees everything and it doesn't even bother him. He doesn't notice. Other people have this view of God, and this is the one that a lot of religious people have, that he's kind of this angry judge. And he's sitting up there in heaven, and he's looking down, he's watching your life, and he's watching my life, and he's keeping this record of every sin you commit and every misstep you make, and he's just waiting for that moment when he can lower the boom on you and punish you for every sin you've ever committed. Some people have this view of God. He's kind of like Santa Claus. He's got this list, and he's checking it twice, and he's going to see who's naughty and who's nice. And if you're on the naughty list, then you got a lot to answer for. Then, of course, there are other views of God. Some people view him as he's an absentee dad that you can never get in touch with. Or maybe a demanding boss whose expectations you can never live up to. But if you look at what John wrote here in the end of verse 18, you begin to understand that the only way to really know what God is like is to look at Jesus. And if you want to know what the Father is like, you have to look at the Son. And when you do that, you discover that he's anything but a detached ruler. He's not an angry judge. He's definitely not an absentee father, because when the time came, he was so desperate to be close to us that he literally became one of us. And when he came, he didn't come in judgment, but he came in love. That's why John says, hey, we've received grace in place of grace, grace on top of grace. He didn't come to condemn us, but instead he came to rescue us. And so not only is he all-powerful, and not only does he understand what we're going through, he loves us enough to go through it with us. Earlier, I read you a quote from Tim Keller, great preacher, in which he talked about how there are two different celebrations that both go by the name Christmas that take place at the exact same time. And he mentioned that there are elements on both sides that make us uncomfortable. Religious people, we get mad when we feel like nobody's paying attention to the real meaning of Christmas. It has nothing to do with the birth of Jesus. And then he said this. He said, on the other hand, Non-religious people can't help but find that the older meaning of Christmas keeps intruding uninvited through the music of traditional Christmas carols. Now, if you're a person that listens to those radio stations that all they play is Christmas music, two things are going to happen. Number one, you're going to go crazy. No, that's not true. The thing that will happen, though, is that eventually you're going to hear something that breaks through all the noise of all the other stuff. And it brings you back to what Christmas is really supposed to be about. One of the most popular Christmas songs is the song, O Come, Emmanuel. Most of you know it. It was originally written in Latin in the 8th century. And for centuries, it was only heard inside of monasteries. But then in the early 1800s, it was rediscovered. It was translated into the English version that most of us are familiar with. And the song itself is based on John 1:14, this idea that the Word became flesh. The word Emmanuel literally means God with us. Now, most of the time we think about God, we think about, God up there or God over there, but John says it's not God up there, over there, it's God with us. And the first verse of the song goes like this: O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel that mourns in lowly exile here until the Son of God appear. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel. Now, if you know the song, you know there's a lot of different versions, a lot of different verses, and all of them are pretty heavy. But it's the 6th verse that's my favorite. Here's what it says. O come thou dayspring from on high, and cheer us by the drawing nigh. Disperse the gloomy clouds of night, and death's dark shadows put to flight. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel. What do you do when it feels like the darkness is getting thicker? What do you do when it feels like the world is just crumbling down on top of you? If you believe what John said, you turn to the one who puts death's dark shadow to flight. John said the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness is not overcome it. I want you to stand where you are. If you're here this morning and you've never accepted that light, I want you to know that we'd love to help you do that. In fact, John says that when you make the decision to receive the light, that God adopts you into his family. At that very moment, you become one of God's children. But I want you to also understand that not everybody makes that decision. Verse 11 is clear that he came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. John makes it clear that there is a decision that has to be, and every single person has to decide, am I going to accept the light or am I going to reject the light? Now, some of you here and some of you watching, you accepted this a long time ago, and so you come this time of year, and it really is a celebration. For others of you, though, you've not yet made that decision, and this time of year is an annual reminder that there's a choice that has to be made. And you can choose to walk in the light, or you can choose to continue in the darkness. If you need some help navigating your way to the light, Dave and I will be here. All you have to do is come up here and hang out with us.